The desert stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of burnt sienna and fading gold beneath a sky that seemed to remember every prayer ever whispered into its vastness. Michael Landon stood at the edge of something he couldn't name, not quite a cliff, not quite a beginning, but a threshold where the air tasted of sage and regret. He was 17 years old, and already the weight of invisible expectations pressed against his chest, like a stone he'd been carrying since birth. His mother had always said he was destined for something greater. She'd whisper it to him in the cramped kitchen of their New Jersey apartment, her hands trembling as she smoothed his hair, her eyes reflecting a hunger that frightened him. Greatness. The word tasted metallic in his mouth, like blood after a schoolyard fight. He didn't want greatness. He wanted to breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. He wanted to sleep without hearing his father's voice echoing through the thin walls, promising violence with every slurred syllable. But the desert didn't care about what he wanted. The desert simply waited, patient and ancient, as if it had seen 1,000 boys like him arrive at its borders, desperate to become someone else. Michael threw a javelin that afternoon, watching it arc through the air with a beauty that made his throat tighten. Athletics had become his language, the only vocabulary that made sense in a world that spoke in disappointments and broken promises. The javelin flew, and for 3 perfect seconds, he was free. College came and went like a fever dream, track and field, scholarships that felt like lifelines thrown to a drowning man. But his body betrayed him, a torn ligament, a shattered dream, and suddenly, the one thing that had kept him tethered to hope evaporated like morning dew in the California sun. He found himself in Los Angeles, another beautiful ghost haunting casting offices and studio lots, carrying a new name he'd chosen like armor. Eugene Orowitz had died somewhere between New Jersey and Hollywood. Michael Landon emerged in his place, all sharp edges and desperate charm. The acting classes felt like learning to breathe underwater. Every exercise was suffocation disguised as art. But he watched, learned, absorbed. He studied the way light fell across faces, the way a single gesture could communicate entire lifetimes of longing. He memorized the grammar of emotion, became fluent in the currency of vulnerability, and slowly, painfully, he discovered something unexpected. He was good at pretending to be other people, better at it than he'd ever been at being himself. Television found him before he found television. A Western series, dust and moral simplicity, black hats and white hats, and clear lines between redemption and damnation. Little Joe Cartwright became his first masterpiece of deception, a character so earnest, so filled with righteous energy, that audiences fell in love with the illusion. Michael inhabited that role like a man possessed, pouring every ounce of his hunger into creating someone lovable, someone worthy, someone whole. The Ponderosa Ranch became more real to him than his own apartment. The fictional family felt safer than the one he'd left behind, and America embraced him with an enthusiasm that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Fan mail arrived in waves, letters from housewives and teenagers, and lonely men who saw in little Joe something they desperately wanted to believe existed in the world. Uncomplicated goodness. But Michael knew the truth. He knew that every smile he manufactured for the camera concealed a labyrinth of darkness he couldn't navigate. He knew that the charm he wielded like a weapon was forged in the furnace of survival, tempered by years of learning how to make people love him so they wouldn't hurt him. He was building a cathedral of light, and he was doing it with hands that trembled in the dark. Marriage came twice before he understood what he was looking for. Children arrived like messengers from a future he wasn't sure he deserved. He held his firstborn son and felt the crushing weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like a yoke. This tiny creature, this perfect, vulnerable being, depended on him entirely. And Michael, who had spent his whole life feeling like an imposter in his own skin, now had to pretend to be someone's father. He threw himself into the role with the same desperate intensity he brought to everything. He would be the father he'd never had. He would create the family that existed only in television scripts. He would rewrite his own history by performing it differently, better, until the performance became indistinguishable from reality. But late at night, when the house fell silent and his wife slept beside him, Michael lay awake and wondered if he was building a home or constructing an elaborate stage set that would collapse at the first strong wind. The Western ended after 14 years, and Michael felt its absence like a phantom limb. He'd grown into that character, had used it as scaffolding to support a self he was still frantically assembling. Without it, he felt exposed, naked, terrifyingly undefined. So he did what he'd always done when faced with the void. He created something new. The idea came to him fully formed, like a vision gifted by something beyond himself. A show about family, about goodness, about the possibility of grace in a fallen world. He pitched it with the fervor of a prophet, his voice carrying conviction he didn't entirely feel. The network executives listened, skeptical but intrigued by his intensity. They gave him a chance, a small window of opportunity, to prove that his vision could translate into ratings. Little House on the Prairie became his second act, his chance at redemption through creation. He wasn't just starring in this show, he was writing it, directing it, shaping every frame, with hands that had learned to control cameras the way a conductor controls an orchestra. He built a world on that soundstage, a universe governed by principles he desperately wanted to believe in. Hard work, integrity, love as the ultimate answer to every question. Charles Ingalls became his greatest performance yet. Pa Ingalls, the perfect father, the moral center of a family and a community, the man who always knew the right thing to say, the right lesson to impart. Michael poured everything into that character, all his longing for goodness, all his desire to be worthy, all his unspoken prayers that maybe somehow performing virtue could transmute into actual virtue. The show exploded into the cultural consciousness like wildfire. Families gathered around television sets every week to watch the Ingalls family navigate hardship with grace and humor. Michael's face became synonymous with fatherhood itself, with a kind of American idealism that people craved in an increasingly complex world. He received letters by the thousands, testimonials from viewers whose lives had been touched by his stories, his characters, his vision of how families should be. And Michael read every letter, searching them like scripture for evidence that he was succeeding, that the persona he'd constructed was working, that he was fooling everyone, including himself. But the letters only intensified the pressure, added weight to the persona he could never remove. He was trapped inside his own creation, imprisoned by the very thing that had set him free. The control he exerted on set became legendary. He directed with an iron will, demanding perfection from every actor, every crew member, every frame of film. People called him difficult, brilliant, obsessed. They didn't understand that the show wasn't just entertainment to him. It was oxygen, it was purpose. It was the only thing standing between Michael Landon and the abyss he'd been running from his entire life. His second marriage crumbled under the weight of his obsession. His children grew up in the shadow of cameras and scripts, watching their father pour love into fictional children with an ease he couldn't quite manage in real life. The contradiction gnawed at him, but he couldn't stop. Stopping meant confronting what lay beneath all the performance, and Michael had spent too many years building walls to tear them down now. He met Cindy during the height of his success, a makeup artist on set whose youth and adoration felt like a lifeline to someone drowning in his own mythology. Their affair was inevitable, destructive, and utterly consuming. Michael, who had built a career playing moral exemplars, found himself enacting the oldest cliché in Hollywood, leaving his family for a younger woman. The irony wasn't lost on him, but by then he'd stopped believing in his own gospel. The tabloids feasted on the scandal. America's favorite father revealed as flawed, human, capable of betrayal. The letters changed tone, became angry, disappointed. Fans felt deceived, as if Michael had violated a sacred contract, and he had in a way. He'd promised them a fantasy, and then reminded them that fantasies are built on lies. Little House ended, but Michael couldn't stop creating. He launched another show, then another, each one a variation on the same themes: redemption, family, the possibility of grace. Highway to Heaven cast him as an actual angel, and the symbolism was so heavy-handed it would have been laughable if it weren't so desperately sincere. Jonathan Smith, the angel who walked among humans, helping them find their way, became Michael's third major incarnation. But something had shifted. The passion that had fueled his earlier work had curdled into compulsion. He was running on fumes, exhausting himself, to maintain an empire of sentiment that felt increasingly hollow. The ratings remained strong, but Michael felt the performance draining him, leaching something essential from his core. His body began sending signals he couldn't ignore: exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, pain that had no clear source. He pushed through it with the same grim determination he brought to everything, convinced that willpower could overcome biology. He'd been fighting invisible battles his whole life. This was just another war to win through sheer force of personality. The diagnosis, when it came, felt both shocking and inevitable. Cancer, aggressive, advanced, the kind that doesn't negotiate or accept compromises. Michael received the news with a strange calm, as if some part of him had been expecting this verdict all along. His body, pushed beyond reasonable limits for decades, had finally issued an ultimatum he couldn't charm or control or direct his way out of. He went public with the diagnosis, appearing on talk shows with the same manufactured optimism he'd brought to everything. He would fight this, he told America. He would beat this disease the way his characters had overcome every obstacle. But in private, away from cameras and expectations, Michael felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the foundation he'd spent 50 years constructing. For the first time since adolescence, he allowed himself to stop performing. He sat with his wife Cindy, with his 9 children from 3 marriages, and tried to have conversations that weren't scripted. He tried to be present without directing the moment, to exist without controlling the narrative. It was terrifying and strange and occasionally transcendent. His children gathered around him, adults now with their own complicated relationships, to the father who had been everywhere and nowhere throughout their childhoods. They shared memories, grievances, gratitude. Michael listened, really listened, hearing in their voices echoes of all the ways he'd succeeded and failed at the one role that mattered most. He'd been a better father to fictional children than to his own, had given Laura Ingalls more attention and wisdom than he'd managed to distribute among his actual offspring. The realization didn't destroy him. Instead, it clarified something. He'd spent his entire life trying to create perfection because he believed anything less than perfect was unworthy of love. But his children loved him anyway, not despite his flaws, but including them. They loved the complicated, contradictory, deeply imperfect man behind all the characters. And that love, unearned and unconditional, broke something open inside him. As his body weakened, Michael found himself revisiting memories with a clarity he'd never allowed before. He remembered his mother's hungry eyes and understood for the first time that her desperation had been about her own unfulfilled dreams, not his inadequacy. He remembered his father's violence and recognized it as the flailing of a man drowning in his own limitations. He remembered every role he'd played, every character he'd inhabited, and saw them all as elaborate love letters to a world he'd wanted so desperately to believe in. The pain became constant, a companion that refused to leave. Morphine softened the edges but couldn't erase the fundamental truth. His body was shutting down, system by system, and no amount of determination could rewrite this ending. Michael, who had directed countless episodes and controlled every frame, had to surrender control of his own final act. He thought about legacy in those last weeks, not the shows or the awards or the iconic characters, but something more essential. What had his life meant beyond the performance? Who was Michael Landon when stripped of all the roles and personas? The question haunted him, but he stopped trying to answer it with certainty. Maybe the search itself was enough. Maybe spending 54 years trying to become someone good, even while failing in countless ways, was its own kind of grace. His last conversation with his oldest son felt like a confession. They sat in the late afternoon light, streaming through hospital windows, and Michael spoke without the usual careful editing. He talked about fear, about regret, about the distance between who he'd wanted to be and who he'd actually been. His son listened, holding his father's hand, and Michael felt something release, some final grip he'd been maintaining on the illusion of control. Michael Landon died on a July afternoon, surrounded by family, his body finally overcome by the disease he'd fought with characteristic stubbornness. The news rippled across America like a shock wave. Millions of people who had never met him mourned genuinely, grieving for the loss of something they couldn't quite name. A particular kind of hope he'd represented, a belief in goodness that felt increasingly rare. The obituaries cataloged his achievements, the iconic roles, the ratings, the cultural impact, but they couldn't capture the complicated truth of the man who had created all those perfect fathers and angels while struggling to be human. They couldn't articulate the peculiar courage it took to spend a lifetime performing virtue in hopes of somehow earning it. His children scattered his ashes in places that had mattered to him, the California hills, the ranch set where he'd filmed so many episodes, the desert where a teenage boy had once thrown a javelin and dreamed of flying. They each carried pieces of him, fragments of memory and DNA, and learned behavior, and they would spend years untangling the complicated legacy of loving someone who had loved them imperfectly but genuinely. The shows lived on in syndication, eternal in their optimism, untouched by the messy reality of their creator. New generations discovered Little House and Highway to Heaven, finding in them the same comfort their parents had. Michael's face, forever young on those screens, continued speaking lines he'd written decades earlier, offering wisdom he'd spent a lifetime trying to believe in. In the end, perhaps that was enough. He'd created beauty in a world that desperately needed it. He'd told stories that helped people feel less alone. He'd played angels and fathers and heroes with such conviction that millions had believed in them, and through believing had found reasons to believe in themselves. That he'd done all this while battling his own demons didn't diminish the gift. It made it more remarkable. Michael Landon never achieved the perfection he'd chased so relentlessly, but he'd created something more valuable, a body of work that reminded people of who they hoped to be, of the families they wanted to build, of the grace they might find in ordinary moments. He'd built cathedrals of light while stumbling through darkness, and those cathedrals still stand, sheltering anyone who needs to believe that goodness is possible, that redemption is real, that love, however imperfect, might be enough. The desert remembers him still. The javelin he threw as a boy landed somewhere in California soil, and maybe it's still there, buried beneath decades of growth and change, a talisman of the moment before Eugene became Michael, before the performance began. And maybe that's the real legacy, not the shows or the characters, but the simple, extraordinary act of a frightened boy deciding to become someone brave, someone good, someone worthy of love, and spending 54 years trying to make that transformation real. He never quite succeeded. But the trying, the relentless, exhausting, beautiful trying, was its own kind of grace,